To understand why you would not last a day in the Roman Empire, we must begin at the very beginning of the day, which occurred at dawn. The Romans, like most ancient peoples, did not have electric lighting or alarm clocks. Instead, they relied on the natural rhythm of the sun to structure their days. This meant that people would wake when the sun rose, which varied throughout the year depending on the season. In summer, when days were long, Romans would wake very early, perhaps around what we would call 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. In winter, when days were shorter, they might wake later, around 6 or 7 o'clock. This variability in wake time would be the first challenge you would face. Your body, accustomed to a consistent alarm clock and perhaps multiple snooze button presses, would struggle to adapt to this solar-based schedule that changed throughout the year. The sleeping arrangements in a Roman home would be quite different from what you are accustomed to. The Romans did have beds, though the quality varied greatly, depending on social class. A wealthy Roman might sleep on a wooden bed frame with interwoven leather straps, or rope to support a mattress stuffed with wool, feathers, or even silk. However, most Romans slept on much simpler arrangements. A common person might have a simple wooden platform, or even just a mat on the floor with perhaps a thin mattress stuffed with straw or reeds. The joint mattress, regardless of its quality, would be far less comfortable than a modern mattress with its springs, foam, and carefully engineered support. You would likely wake with a sore back and stiff joints, especially if you were sleeping on one of the simpler arrangements used by the majority of Romans. The pillow would be similarly primitive, perhaps a small cushion stuffed with wool or feathers, or, in some cases, a hard wooden or stone headrest that would seem impossibly uncomfortable by modern standards. The joint room in which you slept would vary greatly depending on your social station. If you were a wealthy Roman, you might have a private bedroom called a cubiculum in a large house or domus. This room would have walls decorated with frescoes, perhaps depicting scenes from mythology or daily life. The floor might be covered with a mosaic made of tiny colored tiles arranged in intricate patterns. However, even in a wealthy home, there would be no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters that could be opened or closed. This meant that the room would be quite dark even during the day when the shutters were closed, and it would be difficult to control temperature and ventilation. If you were a common Roman, you might live in an insula, which was a multi-story apartment building. These buildings were often poorly constructed with thin walls that provided little sound insulation. You would hear your neighbors arguing, children crying, and various other noises throughout the night, making it difficult to sleep soundly. The rooms in an insula would be small and cramped, with multiple family members often sharing a single room. There would be minimal furniture and no decoration beyond perhaps some simple paint on the walls. Temperature control would be a significant challenge. In summer, Rome could be extremely hot, with temperatures regularly exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Without air conditioning or even electric fans, the only way to stay cool would be to open windows and hope for a breeze, to seek shade during the hottest parts of the day, and to minimize physical activity. Your sleeping room would retain heat from the day, making it difficult to sleep comfortably at night. You would lie awake, sweating, unable to find a comfortable position. In winter, Rome could be surprisingly cold, with temperatures sometimes dropping below freezing at night. The Romans did have a form of central heating called a hypocaust, but this was found only in the homes of the wealthy and in public baths. The hypocaust worked by heating air in a furnace and allowing it to circulate under the floor and through channels in below the walls. However, most Romans had no such luxury. They would rely on portable braziers filled with burning charcoal for heat, which provided limited warmth and also posed a fire hazard and produced potentially dangerous fumes. Upon waking, you would need to dress yourself in Roman clothing, which was quite different from modern attire. Men typically wore a tunic, which was a simple garment made from 2 rectangles of cloth sewn together at the sides and shoulders, with openings for the head and arms. The tunic would reach to about the knees for most men, though slaves and laborers might wear shorter tunics for ease of movement. Over the tunic, a Roman citizen might wear a toga for formal occasions, though the toga was cumbersome and was not worn for everyday activities by most people. The toga was a large semi-circular piece of cloth, typically made of wool, that was draped over the body in a specific way. Putting on a toga correctly required practice and often the assistance of a slave. The fabric was heavy, and the draping was complex, with specific folds that needed to be maintained. Once donned, the toga restricted movement and was hot to wear, especially in the Roman summer. Modern people accustomed to clothes that are pre-sewn and simply pulled on would struggle with the process of putting on a toga and would likely find it uncomfortable to wear. Women wore a similar tunic called a tunic, which was longer than but the men's version, typically reaching to the ankles. Over this, married women would wear a stola, which was another long garment, often with sleeves. When going out in public, women would also wear a pulla, which was a large rectangular shawl that could be draped over the head and shoulders. The layers of clothing would be hot in summer, and the lack of modern fabrics like cotton or synthetic fibers would make the wool and linen garments less comfortable than what you were used to. Footwear presented another adjustment. The Romans wore sandals for most occasions. These sandals, called calce or solea depending on the style, were made of leather and consisted of a sole attached to the foot with leather straps. The straps might be quite simple or quite elaborate, depending on fashion and social status. However, many Romans, particularly slaves and the poor, went barefoot much of the time. The streets of Rome were paved with large stones in some areas, but in many places they were simply dirt or gravel. Walking on these surfaces without modern cushioned shoes would quickly lead to sore, blistered feet. After dressing, you would need to attend to your morning hygiene. The Romans did value cleanliness, at least among the upper classes, but their methods were quite different from modern practices. Most Roman homes, particularly the insula, where common people lived, did not have running water. Water would need to be obtained from public fountains, which were fed by the famous Roman aqueducts. The aqueducts brought water from distant sources into the city, where it flowed to public fountains, baths, and the homes of the wealthy. If you lived in an insula, you would need to go to the public fountain to fetch water. This meant carrying a heavy clay amphora or bronze bucket to fountain, waiting in line with other people, filling your container, and then carrying it back home. An amphora full of water could weigh 30 pounds or more, and if you lived on an upper floor of an insula, you would need to climb stairs while carrying this weight. This would be exhausting, especially if you needed to make multiple trips to supply enough water for your household's needs. Once you had water, you could wash yourself, but the process would be quite different from a modern shower or bath. You might pour water over yourself from a jug, or you might wipe yourself down with a damp cloth. Soap existed in the Roman world, though it was not as common as it would become in later periods. Roman soap was made from animal fats and wood ashes, creating a harsh, alkaline substance quite different from modern soap. Many Romans preferred to clean themselves with olive oil, rubbing it on their skin and then scraping it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. Much like the ancient Greeks, this method of cleaning, while it could remove some dirt and dead skin, was not as effective as modern bathing with soap and hot running water. You would not achieve the level of cleanliness you are accustomed to, and you would likely feel somewhat grimy throughout the day. Your hair would also be difficult to keep clean. Most Romans washed their hair only occasionally, using a mixture of water and perhaps some clay or plant extracts to cleanse it. Without modern shampoo and conditioner, your hair would likely be tangled, oily, and uncomfortable. Dental hygiene was similarly primitive. The Romans did clean their teeth using various methods, including chewing sticks, rubbing with cloth, and using tooth powders made from abrasive substances such as crushed bones, oyster shells, or pumice stone. Some tooth powders also included ingredients like charcoal or even crushed brick. While these abrasives could remove some surface stains and debris, they could also damage tooth enamel over time. The Romans had no understanding of the importance of removing bacteria and food particles to prevent decay and gum disease. Toothbrushes as we know them did not exist, so cleaning between teeth was nearly impossible. As a result, most Romans would have had significant dental problems by middle age. Tooth decay, gum disease, and tooth loss were common, and there was no effective treatment beyond extraction if a tooth became too painful. Without modern anesthesia, having a tooth pulled would be an agonizing experience. You would sit or stand while someone gripped the tooth with a primitive forceps and yanked it out, likely causing significant damage to surrounding teeth and gums in the process. After attending to hygiene, you would need to eat breakfast. The Roman breakfast, called enientaculum, was typically a very simple affair. It might consist of bread, perhaps dipped in wine or water, to soften it, along with cheese, olives, or dried fruit. The bread would be quite different from modern bread. Roman bread was made from wheat or for the poor, from cheaper grains like barley. It would be dense and heavy, with a coarse texture and a somewhat sour taste from the sourdough fermentation process used to leaven it. The wheat used to make bread was ground into flour using millstones, and inevitably, small particles of stone would end up in the flour. This gritty flour would be baked into the bread, and eating it day after day would gradually wear down your teeth. This is one reason why dental problems were so common among Romans. The cheese would be made from sheep or goat milk and would have a strong, tangy flavor, quite different from mild modern cheeses. It would also be quite salty, as salt was used as a preservative. The olives would be preserved in brine, making them very salty as well. While olives were a staple of the Roman diet and were nutritious, eating them for breakfast might seem strange if you are accustomed to sweeter breakfast foods like cereal, pancakes, or pastries. The dried fruit might include figs, dates, or raisins, which would provide some sweetness and variety, but these were expensive and would only be available to those with some means. The wine drunk at breakfast, if you had wine, would be mixed with water, as drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric by Romans. The ratio of wine to water would vary, but it might be anywhere from 1 part wine to 2 parts water, up to 1 part wine to 8 parts water or more. Even diluted, drinking wine at breakfast might seem inappropriate by modern standards. The wine itself would be quite different from modern wine, often rougher and more acidic, and sometimes flavored with honey, spices, or herbs. This breakfast would not provide very much energy or nutrition compared to a modern breakfast that might include eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice, and coffee. You would likely still feel hungry after eating, but there would be limited options for snacking throughout the day. The Romans typically ate only one main meal per day, called cena, which was taken in the late afternoon or early evening. There might be a light midday meal called prandium, but this was often just a continuation of breakfast foods or some cold leftovers. The lack of coffee or tea would be a severe challenge for many modern people. The Romans had no access to caffeine in any form. Coffee comes from plants native to Africa and was unknown to the Romans. Tea comes from China and was similarly unknown. If you rely on coffee to help you wake up and feel alert in the morning, you would struggle without it. You would likely feel sluggish, foggy-headed, and unable to concentrate. Your productivity would suffer, and you would long for that morning cup of coffee that you took for granted in the modern world. After breakfast, you would need to begin the day's work. The nature of this work would depend greatly on your social status and occupation in Roman society. Let us consider several possibilities, as each would present its own set of challenges that would make it difficult for you to last even a single day in the Roman Empire. If you were a common laborer, which many Romans were, you would be engaged in physically demanding work from dawn until dusk. This might involve working in construction, loading and unloading goods at the docks, working in a workshop, or any number of other manual labor jobs. The work would be hard, the hours would be long, and the pay would be minimal. You would be on your feet all day, performing repetitive motions that would cause your muscles to ache and your joints to throb. Construction work in ancient Rome was particularly brutal. Without modern machinery, everything had to be done with human and animal power. Moving heavy stones, mixing mortar, lifting materials to scaffolding. All of these tasks required tremendous physical effort. The Romans did use simple machines like pulleys, levers, and inclined planes to help with the work, but these only made the tasks possible, not easy. You would still be straining every muscle in your body, sweating profusely in the summer heat, breathing in dust and lime from the mortar, and risking injury from falling objects or structural collapses. If you were a slave, your situation would be even worse. Slavery was fundamental to the Roman economy, and slaves performed much of the labor throughout the empire. As a slave, you would have no rights whatsoever. You would be property owned by your master, who could sell you, beat you, work you to death, or kill you with minimal fear of consequences. The work required of slaves varied tremendously. Some slaves worked in wealthy households, serving as cooks, cleaners, secretaries, or tutors. While this work was not as physically demanding as field labor or mining, household slaves were still subject to their master's whims and could be punished severely for any perceived failing. Other slaves worked in agriculture, toiling in the fields from dawn to dusk, planting, tending, and harvesting crops. The work was backbreaking, the hours were endless, and the treatment was often harsh. Agricultural slaves might be chained at night to prevent escape and might be beaten to encourage them to work harder. The sun would beat down on you mercilessly. You would be covered in dirt and sweat, and your hands would be raw and blistered from handling tools and rough plants. The worst fate for a slave was to be sent to work in the mines. The Romans extracted various minerals, including gold, silver, iron, copper, and lead, from mines throughout the empire. Mining was dangerous, exhausting work performed in terrible conditions. Slaves in the mines worked in narrow, dark tunnels deep underground, chipping away at the rock face with hand tools. The air was bad, filled with dust that would damage the lungs. Cave-ins were common, burying workers alive. Many slaves sent to the mines died within a few years from accidents, disease, or simply from exhaustion. If you were a craftsman or shopkeeper, your work would be less physically demanding, but still challenging. Let us consider the example of a baker, as bread was a staple of the Roman diet and bakeries were common throughout Rome. As a baker, you would wake in the middle of the night or very early in the morning to begin preparing dough for the day's bread. The process would be similar to what we described for ancient Greece: grinding grain into flour, mixing the flour with boiling water and salt and leaven, kneading the dough, allowing it to rise, shaping it into loaves, and baking it in an oven. However, Roman bakeries were typically larger operations than point Greek households, and they used more advanced technology. Many bakeries had large millstones powered by donkeys or slaves rather than just hand mills. The donkey would be harnessed to a beam attached to the upper millstone, and it would walk in circles, turning the stone and grinding the grain. This was more efficient than hand grinding, but it was still slow and labor-intensive. Someone needed to feed grain into the mill, collect the flour, and manage the donkey. The ovens used in Roman bakeries were large dome structures heated by wood fires. Getting the oven to the right temperature and maintaining that temperature required skill and experience. The loaves would be placed on the hot oven floor using a long wooden paddle called a peel, then removed when they were baked. The work would be hot and tiring, especially in summer. Your hands and arms would ache from kneading dough and manipulating the heavy loaves. The heat from the oven would be intense, and you would be covered in flour dust that would get into your nose and throat. As a shopkeeper, you would also need to interact with customers, handle money, keep accounts, and manage inventory. The Romans did use coins for currency, which made transactions easier than barter, but dealing with money had its own challenges. Coins could be counterfeit, they could be clipped or filed to remove some of the precious metal, and they came in various denominations that needed to be correctly valued. You would need to be constantly alert to avoid being cheated. If you were a woman in the Roman Empire, your fat situation and your daily activities would be quite different from those of a man. Roman women had more freedom than their Greek counterparts in some ways, but they were still subject to significant legal and social constraints. Women could not vote, hold political office, or serve in the Saemi. They were under the legal authority of their fathers or husbands through a system called paterfamilias, though by the late Republic and early Empire, some of these restrictions had been loosened for women of the upper classes. A woman's primary role was still seen as managing the household and bearing children. If you were a wealthy woman, you would spend your time supervising slaves who did the actual housework, but you would still be responsible for ensuring that everything ran smoothly. You would need to plan meals, manage the household budget, oversee the spinning and weaving of cloth, and ensure that the house was kept clean and orderly. You would also be expected to be a gracious hostess when your husband entertained guests. If you were a point-fed poor woman, you would do all the housework yourself, without the help of slaves. This would include fetching water, preparing food, cleaning, washing clothes, and caring for children. You might also need to work outside the home to help support your family, perhaps by selling goods in the market, working in a shop or tavern, or taking in spinning or weaving. The combination of household duties and paid work would leave you exhausted and with little time for rest or leisure. Regardless of your social class, if you were a woman of childbearing age, you would likely spend much of your adult life either pregnant or nursing. The Romans valued large families, and women were encouraged to have many children. However, childbirth was dangerous, and many women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. The infant mortality rate was also very high, with perhaps 1/3 or more of children dying before their first birthday. The constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and loss would be emotionally and physically exhausting. Chapter 2. The Urban Environment of Rome. Let us now examine the physical environment of the city of Rome itself, as the urban landscape would present numerous challenges. Rome, in its imperial heyday, was the largest city in the ancient world, with a population estimated at around 1 million people. This massive concentration of humanity in a pre-industrial city created conditions that would be shocking and difficult for a modern person to endure. The streets of Rome were narrow, crowded, and filthy. Unlike modern cities with their wide paved streets and traffic regulations, Roman streets were often just barely wide enough for two carts to pass each other. Many streets were paved with large irregular stones that would be uncomfortable to walk on and would make wheeled vehicles bounce and jolt. Other streets were simply packed dirt that would become muddy in rain and dusty in dry weather. There were no sidewalks in most areas, so pedestrians, animals, and vehicles all shared the same space. The congestion on the streets was tremendous. During the day, the streets would be packed with people walking, shopping, conducting business, and socializing. There would be slaves and servants rushing about on errands, merchants transporting goods, craftsmen going to and from their workshops, and countless others pursuing their daily activities. The noise would be overwhelming, with people talking, shouting, arguing, and haggling, animals braying and neighing, wheels rumbling on the pavement, and various craftsmen hammering, sawing, and engaging in their trades. To make matters worse, Julius Caesar had instituted regulations that banned wheeled vehicles from the city during daylight hours, with some exception for construction vehicles and vehicles involved in religious ceremonies. This meant that goods had to be transported into and through the city at night, when the streets would be filled with carts and wagons making their deliveries. The noise of these vehicles, combined with the shouting of drivers and handlers, would make it nearly impossible to sleep if you lived near a major street. The smell of Rome would be another assault on the senses. In a city of 1 million people with no modern sanitation system, the accumulation of human and animal waste was a constant problem. While the Romans did have public latrines and some homes were connected to sewers, much waste was simply thrown into the streets. Chamber pots would be emptied out of windows, creating a hazard for anyone walking below. Animal dung from the countless horses, donkeys, and oxen that moved through the city would accumulate in the streets. The famous Roman sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, and its associated channels, did carry some waste away, but it was not comprehensive, and it often backed up or overflowed. Dead animals, rotting garbage, and pools of stagnant water would create breeding grounds for flies, mosquitoes, and rats. The summer heat would intensify the smells, making them nearly unbearable. You would need to watch your step constantly to avoid stepping in something unpleasant, and you would need to breathe through your mouth to avoid the point. Worst of the odors, the risk of disease in this environment was significant. Without understanding of germ theory, the Romans did not know that disease could be transmitted through contaminated water, food, or contact with human waste. Diseases of the digestive system, including dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera, would have been common. Malaria was endemic in parts of Italy, including areas around Rome. Tuberculosis, various parasitic infections, and numerous other diseases spread easily in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. As a modern person, your immune system would not be prepared for the disease environment of ancient Rome. You would have no resistance to the specific pathogens circulating in the Roman population. You would become sick almost immediately, perhaps within hours or days of arrival. The illness might be relatively mild, such as traveler's diarrhea, or it might be severe and life-threatening. Without modern medicine, even relatively minor illnesses could become serious. The public water supply, while better than in many ancient cities, thanks to the aqueducts, was still not safe by modern standards. Water flowed from the aqueducts to public fountains, public baths, and some private homes. However, the lead pipes used in some parts of the system could contaminate the water with lead, and the open fountains were vulnerable to contamination from various sources. You would be taking a risk every time you drank water or ate food prepared with water. Housing for the majority of Romans was inadequate and dangerous. As mentioned, most Romans lived in insular multi-story apartment buildings. These buildings were often poorly constructed by speculative builders looking to maximize profit. They might be 5, 6, or even 7 stories tall, built with thin walls and minimal structural support. The ground floor might be built of stone or brick, but upper floors were often built of wood and mud brick, with shared walls that were dangerously thin. Fires were a constant danger in Insula. Cooking was done over open flames, heating was provided by braziers full of burning charcoal, and lighting was provided by oil lamps with open flames. The combination of open flames, wooden construction, and crowded conditions made fires frequent and devastating. Once a fire started in an insula, it could spread rapidly through the building and to neighboring buildings. The Romans did have fire brigades called vigilos, but their equipment and methods were primitive, and they could rarely save a building once it was well ablaze. If you lived in an insula, you would go to sleep each night with the knowledge that you might be awakened by fire and need to flee for your life. Upper floor residents were particularly vulnerable, as they might be trapped by smoke and flames before they could reach the stairs. Many people died in fires in Rome, and many more were left homeless when their buildings burned. There was no insurance, no government assistance to help you rebuild. If fire destroyed your home, you would simply have to find somewhere else to live and start over. Structural collapses were another danger. The poorly built insula sometimes simply fell down, especially after heavy rain, weakened the foundations, or when overambitious builders added too many stories. The collapse might happen without warning, burying residents under tons of rubble. Again, the residents of upper floors were particularly vulnerable, as they had the furthest to fall and the most debris above them. Rescue efforts would be hampered by the lack of modern equipment, and many people buried in collapses would die before they could be extracted. Even if your building did not burn or collapse, living conditions in an insula would be unpleasant. The apartments would be small, dark, and poorly ventilated. There would be no running water in upper floor apartments, meaning you would need pull to carry water up the stairs for all your needs. There would be no toilets. You would need to use a chamber pot and then carry it down to empty it, or you would need to go out to a public latrine. The lack of sanitation facilities in the apartments meant that smells would accumulate, especially in hot weather. The lack of privacy would also be difficult. Walls would be thin, so you would hear your neighbors constantly. Multiple families might share a single floor, or even a single large room divided by curtains. Your personal life would be entirely visible to those around you, and theirs would be visible to you. Any arguments, any intimate moments, any private conversations would be overheard. This lack of privacy would be psychologically stressful, especially for someone accustomed to modern apartments or houses with solid walls and doors that lock. The insula also had no security. There would be no locks on the main door of the building, and often no locks on individual apartments. Theft was common, and there was little that could be done to prevent it. You would need to keep your possessions, such as they were, with you or hidden. Anything left unattended might be stolen. At night, gangs might roam the streets, robbing people or breaking into ground floor shops and apartments. The wealthy, of course, lived in much better conditions. A wealthy Roman would own a domus, a private house, built around one or more courtyards. These houses could be quite large and luxurious, with many rooms, beautiful decorations, private water supplies, and sometimes even private baths. However, even wealthy Romans faced challenges that would be difficult for modern people. Their houses were still vulnerable to fire. Though less so than insulae, they still had to deal with the noise, smells, and crowds of the city whenever they ventured out. And they faced other dangers including robbery, assassination by political rivals, and the jealousy of emperors who might confiscate their property on trumped-up charges. Chapter 3: Health and Medicine in Rome. Let us examine in more detail the state of medical knowledge and practice in ancient Rome, as this would be one of the areas where the gap between the ancient and modern worlds is most stark and most deadly. While the Romans did have physicians and some medical knowledge, their understanding of disease and their methods of treatment were limited and often ineffective or even harmful. Roman medicine was based largely on the theories inherited from Greek physicians, particularly the theory of the four humors. According to this theory, the body contained four fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was thought to result from a proper balance of these humors, while disease resulted from an imbalance. Each humor was associated with certain qualities. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm was cold and moist, yellow bile was hot and dry, and black bile was cold and dry. Treatment of disease involved trying to restore the balance of humors. This might be done through diet, as different foods were thought to have different humoral qualities. It might be done through bloodletting, which involved deliberately cutting the vein to remove excess blood. It might be done through purging, using laxatives or emetics to clear the body of bad humors. Or it might be done through various herbal remedies, some of which had genuine medicinal properties, but many of which were useless or harmful. Bloodletting was a common treatment for many conditions. If you fell ill with a fever, a Roman physician might bleed you, believing that the fever was caused by an excess of blood. In reality, losing blood would make you weaker and less able to fight off whatever infection was causing the fever. Repeated bloodletting could lead to anemia and might even be fatal. Yet this practice continued for centuries because it seemed to work in some cases, mainly because people sometimes recovered despite the bloodletting rather than because of it. Pain management was primitive. For minor pain, you would simply have to endure it, as there were no over-the-counter pain relievers like aspirin or ibuprofen. For more severe pain, opium was available and was an effective pain reliever. The Romans knew about opium and used it medicinally, extracting it from poppy plants. However, opium was expensive and not always available. For most people suffering from pain, there was little relief available. You would just have to suffer through it and hope the pain would eventually subside. Surgery was practiced in ancient Rome, and Roman surgeons developed an impressive array of surgical instruments, including scalpels, forceps, hooks, probes, and saws. These instruments were made of bronze or iron and were surprisingly sophisticated. Roman military surgeons in particular became skilled at treating wounds, removing arrows and other projectiles, and performing amputations when necessary. However, surgery was still extremely dangerous due to the lack of anesthesia and antiseptics. Without anesthesia, surgery was agonizingly painful. A patient might be given wine or opium to dull the pain slightly, but they would still feel every cut, every probe, every manipulation of tissues. The shock from the pain alone could be fatal. Patients might be held down by strong men to keep them from thrashing during the procedure, or they might be given something to bite down on to keep from screaming. The psychological trauma of undergoing surgery without anesthesia would be severe. Even if you survived the surgery itself, infection was a serious risk. Without understanding of germs and antisepsis, Roman surgeons did not know to sterilize their instruments or wash their hands. Surgical instruments might be wiped clean between patients, but they were not disinfected. The surgeon's hands might be dirty. The surgical site would not be properly cleaned before or after the procedure. As a result, many patients developed infections in their wounds, which often proved fatal. Wound infections would cause the wound to become red, swollen, hot, and painful. Pus would accumulate in the wound. The patient would develop a fever. If the infection spread to the bloodstream, causing sepsis, the patient would become delirious and might die within days. Without antibiotics, there was little that could be done, except to drain the pus and hope the body could fight off the infection. Many patients did not survive. Broken bones were treated by setting them, which meant manipulating the broken ends back into alignment, then immobilizing the limb with splints and bandages. This process was painful without anesthesia, and it was not always successful. If the bone was not properly aligned, it might heal crooked, causing permanent deformity and loss of function. If the break had pierced the skin, creating an open wound, infection was almost inevitable, and the patient might die or might need to have the limb amputated to save their life. Amputations were performed when a limb was severely damaged or infected beyond hope of recovery. The surgeon would cut through the flesh and saw through the bone, then cauterize the blood vessels with a hot iron to stop the bleeding. The pain would be indescribable, and the buoyant shock could kill the patient. If they survived the procedure, infection was still a risk, and many amputees died in the days or weeks following the surgery. Those who survived were left disabled in a society that had no social safety net and no accommodations for people with disabilities. Dental problems, as mentioned earlier, were common and difficult to treat. Tooth decay would cause pain that could be severe and constant. If a tooth became abscessed, the infection could spread to the jawbone and even to the brain, causing death. The only treatment was extraction, which would be done without anesthesia using forceps to grip the tooth and wrench it out. The extraction might break the tooth, leaving roots behind that would continue to cause problems. It might damage adjacent teeth. The pain would be terrible, and the patient would need to endure it while remaining still enough for the dentist to work. Vision problems were largely untreatable. If you were nearsighted, farsighted, or had other refractive errors, you would simply have to live with blurred vision. Eyeglasses had not been invented and would not be invented for many centuries. If you developed cataracts as you aged, causing your vision to become increasingly cloudy, there was a procedure called couching that could be attempted. This involved using a needle to push the clouded lens to the bottom of the eye, out of the line of sight. However, this procedure was painful, often unsuccessful, and carried a high risk of infection or other complications. Hearing loss was similarly untreatable. If you became deaf or hard of hearing, there were no hearing aids to help you. You would struggle to understand speech and would miss much of what was said around you. People might speak loudly to you, or might simply give up trying to communicate. Your social isolation would increase, and you would be cut off from much of what was happening in your community. Chronic diseases that we can manage today would be debilitating or fatal in ancient Rome. Diabetes would gradually kill you, as your body failed to regulate blood sugar. Heart disease would cause increasing weakness and shortness of breath, until your heart finally gave out. Kidney disease would cause toxins to accumulate in your blood, leading to increasingly severe symptoms and eventually death. Cancer would grow unchecked, causing pain and wasting until it killed you. Mental illness was poorly understood. The Romans recognized that some people had problems with their minds, but their understanding was based on the same humoral theory used for physical illness. Depression might be seen as an excess of black bile. Mania might be seen as an excess of yellow bile. Treatment would involve trying to rebalance the humors through diet, purging, bloodletting, or herbal remedies. None of these would be effective for serious mental illness. People with severe mental illness might be confined to their homes, chained up to prevent them from harming themselves or others. They might be beaten in an attempt to drive out the demons or evil spirits that were thought to possess them. The stigma associated with mental illness was severe, and families might hide away their mentally ill members to avoid shame. The suffering of both the mentally ill person and their family would be immense. Infectious diseases would sweep through the population periodically, causing epidemics that killed thousands or even millions. The Romans had no concept of contagion and no effective public health measures. When plague struck, there was little that could be done, except to pray to the gods and hope to be spared. The sick would die in large numbers, and the dead would need to be disposed of quickly to prevent their bodies from rotting and spreading disease. Though the Romans did not understand why this was necessary. The psychological impact of living in constant fear of disease, injury, and death would be severe. You would watch friends and family members sicken and die, often suddenly and for no apparent reason. Children would die in large numbers, and you would become accustomed to the idea that not all of your children would survive to adulthood. You would live with the knowledge that any illness or injury could be fatal, that there was no effective medical help available, and that when your time came you would likely die, in pain and fear. Chapter 4. Food and Nutrition in Rome. Let us examine in more detail what Romans ate and how food was obtained, prepared, and consumed, as diet was another area where the gap between ancient and modern life would be immediately apparent. While the Romans had access to a reasonable variety of foods, the quality, safety, and preparation methods would all be quite different from what you are accustomed to. The staple food for most Romans was grain, particularly wheat, though the poor might eat barley, millet, or other cheaper grains. This grain was made into bread, which was consumed at every meal. As discussed earlier, Roman bread was dense and coarse, quite different from soft modern bread. The grinding process left grit in the flour, which would wear down teeth over time. The bread would also go stale quickly, as there were no preservatives and no plastic bags to keep it fresh. You would be eating somewhat stale bread much of the time. Porridge, made from grain, was another staple. This porridge, called pulse, was made by boiling ground grain in water or milk until it formed a thick mush. It might be flavored with salt, olive oil, cheese, or vegetables. While porridge was filling and nutritious, it was also bland and monotonous. Eating it day after day, meal after meal, would quickly become tiresome. Yet for many poor Romans, porridge was the main food, sometimes the porridge diet. Vegetables were an important part of the diet. The Romans grew and ate a variety of vegetables, including onions, garlic, leeks, cabbage, lettuce, beets, turnips, radishes, carrots, and various legumes such as lentils, chickpeas, and beans. These vegetables were typically boiled, as the Romans had limited cooking fats other than olive oil, which was expensive. Boiled vegetables without salt, butter, or other seasonings would be quite bland by modern standards. Olive oil was the primary cooking fat and was used extensively in Roman cuisine. However, it was not cheap, and poor families would use it sparingly. The olive oil available would also be quite different from modern extra virgin olive oil. Roman olive oil was often pressed multiple times, with the first pressing producing the best quality oil and subsequent pressings producing increasingly inferior oil that might be rancid or bitter. Lower quality oil might be used for cooking or for lamps rather than for eating. Meat was a luxury for most Romans. The wealthy might eat meat regularly, including pork, beef, lamb, goat, chicken, game birds, and various game animals. However, most Romans ate meat only occasionally, perhaps at festivals or special occasions. When meat was available, it would often be preserved by salting, smoking, or drying, as there was no refrigeration. Preserved meat was very salty and tough, quite different from fresh meat. Fish was more common than meat in the Roman diet, especially in coastal areas. Fresh fish would be sold in markets, though without refrigeration it would spoil quickly. The smell of a Roman fish market would be intense, especially in summer. Salted fish was a common preserved food, used to add flavor to otherwise bland meals. The most famous Roman fish product was garum, a fermented fish sauce made from fish guts and salt. Garum was used as a condiment, much as soy sauce is used in Asian cuisine today, but its strong, pungent flavor would be off-putting to most modern people. Cheese was commonly eaten and was an important source of protein. Roman cheese was made from sheep or goat milk and was typically hard and salty. It would not taste like mild, modern cheeses such as cheddar or mozzarella. The flavor would be much stronger and more pungent. Cheese was often used in cooking or eaten with bread rather than being eaten alone. Fruits were eaten when in season. The Romans grew and ate apples, pears, cherries, plums, grapes, figs, and pomegranates. Citrus fruits like oranges and lemons were not widely available in Rome during most of its history. Fruit was eaten fresh when available, or it might be dried for preservation. Dried figs, dates, and raisins were common foods that could be stored and eaten throughout the year. However, fresh fruit was expensive and was more likely to be eaten by the wealthy than by the poor. Honey was the primary sweetener, as sugar cane was not widely available in the Roman world. Honey was used to sweeten foods and drinks, and it was used in cooking and baking. However, honey was expensive, and most Romans used it sparingly, if at all. The diet of the poor would have contained very little sweet food, which would be a difficult adjustment for modern people accustomed to sugar being available in abundance. The spices and seasonings available to Roman cooks were limited compared to what is available today. Salt was important but expensive, as it had to be obtained from the sea or from salt mines and then transported. Pepper and other spices from the east were extremely expensive luxury goods available only to the wealthy. The Romans did use herbs including coriander, cumin, oregano, mint, and rue to flavor their food, but the range of flavors would be quite limited compared to a modern kitchen. Food safety was a serious concern. Without refrigeration or understanding of foodborne pathogens, food poisoning was common. Meat and fish would spoil quickly in the heat. Milk would sour within hours. Prepared foods sold by street vendors might be contaminated with various harmful bacteria. You would need to be very careful about what you ate, but even with caution, you would likely suffer from periodic bouts of stomach upset, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. The water supply, as mentioned, was potentially contaminated with lead from pipes, with various pollutants, and with disease-causing organisms. The Romans recognized that water quality varied and that some sources were better than others, but they had no way to purify water beyond letting it settle and perhaps filtering it through cloth. Drinking wine, even diluted wine, was often safer than drinking water, but it had its own issues, including potential adulteration or contamination during production and storage. Food preparation was time-consuming and labor-intensive. Without modern appliances, everything had to be done by hand. Grinding grain, kneading dough, tending cooking fires, and cleaning up afterward all required significant effort. A wealthy household would have slaves to do this work, but most people did it themselves or with the help of family members. The hours spent each day on food preparation would seem excessive to modern people accustomed to convenience foods and electric appliances. Cooking was done over open fires or in clay ovens, making temperature control difficult. Food might be burned on the outside and raw on the inside, or it might be overcooked and dried out. Without thermometers or timers, cooks relied on experience and judgment to determine when food was done. Meals might be quite variable in quality from day to day depending on the skill of the cook and the behavior of the fire. The main meal of the day, the cena, was typically eaten in the late afternoon or early evening. For wealthy Romans, this might be an elaborate affair with multiple courses and entertainment. Diners would recline on couches, arranged around a table, eating with their fingers or using spoons and knives. Forks had not been invented, so food would be picked up with the fingers or scooped up with bread. Your hands would become greasy and messy, and there would be no paper napkins, only cloth napkins that would need to be washed. For common Romans, the cena would be much simpler, perhaps just bread, porridge, vegetables, and maybe some cheese or olives. The meal would be eaten sitting on benches or stools, or even standing. There would be no elaborate table settings or decorations. The focus would be on consuming enough food to satisfy hunger, not on enjoying a gastronomic experience. The portions of food available to most Romans would be smaller than what modern people are accustomed to eating. While the wealthy might indulge in large meals with multiple courses, the most Romans would be smaller than what modern people are accustomed to eating. While the wealthy might indulge in large meals with multiple courses, the poor would often be eating at a subsistence level, consuming just enough calories to maintain basic health, but not enough to feel truly satiated. You would go to bed hungry more often than not, and the constant feeling of not having quite enough to eat would be psychologically wearing. Malnutrition was common, especially among the poor. Deficiencies in vitamins and minerals would cause various health problems, including night blindness from lack of vitamin A, scurvy from lack of vitamin C, and rickets from lack of vitamin C, and rickets from lack of vitamin D. Protein deficiency would cause muscle wasting and weakness. Iron deficiency would cause anemia, leading to fatigue and shortness of breath. These nutritional deficiencies would make you more susceptible to disease and would reduce your ability to work effectively. Chapter 5. Daily Routine and Work in Rome. Let us examine in more detail what a typical day of work would be like for various Romans. The specifics would vary greatly, depending on one's occupation and social class, but certain patterns were common across Roman society. The working day would typically begin at dawn or shortly after and would continue until late afternoon or early evening. The Romans divided the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, but unlike our modern hours of fixed length, Roman hours varied with the seasons. In summer, a daytime hour would be longer than in winter. For most people, work would be physically demanding and would be performed without significant breaks. There was no weekend, no 8-hour workday, no paid vacation. You would work every day except for religious festivals. And even on festival days, there would be household tasks that needed to be done. The constant labor without adequate rest would lead to exhaustion, both physical and mental. Let us consider the life of a fuller, someone who worked in the cloth processing industry. Fullers cleaned and processed newly woven cloth to make it usable, a process called fulling. This involved washing the cloth to remove oils and dirt, then treating it to thicken and soften the fibers. The process was unpleasant and labor-intensive. The cloth would be placed in large tubs filled with water and various substances, including urine, which was collected from public urinals and used because it contained ammonia that helped clean the cloth. As a fuller, you would spend hours treading on cloth in these tubs of urine and water, working the liquid through the fabric with your feet. The smell would be terrible, and your feet would become wrinkled and sore from prolonged immersion. After treading, the cloth would be rinsed multiple times, then stretched on frames and brushed with thistles to raise the nap. It would then be treated with fuller's earth, a type of clay, to absorb remaining oils. The finished cloth would be inspected and folded for delivery to the merchant or customer. The work would be repetitive, smelly, and exhausting. You would stand for hours in the tubs, treading the cloth. Your back would ache from bending over the frames to brush and treat the fabric. Your hands would become rough and cracked from constant exposure to water and chemicals. The ammonia fumes from the urine would irritate your eyes and throat. And at the end of the day, you would be exhausted, smelly, and would have earned only a modest wage for your labor. Consider the life of a porter or carrier, someone who made their living by carrying goods for others. Rome was full of people who needed things transported. But the ban on wheeled vehicles during daylight hours meant that much hauling had to be done by human power. As a porter, you would spend your day carrying heavy loads on your back or tipped on a pole across your shoulders. You might carry amphorae of wine or oil, sacks of grain, bundles of cloth, furniture, or any number of other items. The work would be brutally hard. A loaded amphorae could weigh 60 pounds or more, and you might need to carry it up several flights of stairs to deliver it to an apartment in an insula. Your shoulders and back would be constantly in pain from the heavy loads. You would develop calluses and sores where the loads rested on your body. The constant strain would lead to permanent damage to your spine and joints, and you would age rapidly, becoming bent and unable to work by middle age. Consider the life of a woman working as a laundress. In a city of 1 million people, there was a constant need for laundry services. As a laundress, you would collect dirty laundry from clients, carry it to a water source, wash it, and return it clean. Washing clothes without modern detergents or machines was back-breaking work. You would need to soak the clothes, scrub them on a washboard or rocks, beat them with paddles to loosen dirt, rinse them multiple times, and wring them out. The water would be cold in winter, numbing your hands. Your hands would become chapped and raw from constant immersion in water and from handling harsh soap. Your back would ache from bending over the washing basin or riverbank. The wet laundry would be heavy, and carrying it back to return to clients would be exhausting. And you would need to do this day after day, processing vast quantities of laundry to earn enough money to survive. Consider the life of a tavern keeper or food vendor. The streets of Rome were full of small shops and stalls, selling food and drink to people who had no facilities for cooking in their crowded apartments. As a tavern keeper, you would prepare simple foods like porridge, stew, sausages, and bread, which you would sell to customers. You would also sell wine, which was the preferred drink of most Romans. The work would involve long hours standing in the heat from the cooking fire, preparing food, serving customers, and managing the business. You would need to purchase supplies, maintain your equipment, and handle money. Customers might be drunk and disorderly, might try to cheat you or steal from you. The tavern might be a target for robbers, especially late at night, and the profits would be small, as competition was intense and most customers had little money to spend. If you were engaged in a skilled trade, your work would be somewhat less physically demanding, but would still require long hours and intense concentration. A skilled craftsman, such as a jeweler, a silversmith, or a furniture maker, would spend their days bent over their workbench, carefully shaping materials into finished products. The work would require excellent vision and steady hands, both of which would deteriorate with age, ending your career prematurely. The lighting conditions for fine work would be poor. As mentioned, artificial light came from oil lamps and candles, which provided only dim, flickering light. A craftsman would need to work near a window to take advantage of natural light, which meant that work hours were limited to daylight hours. In winter, when days were short, work time would be limited. The strain of working in poor light would damage your eyesight over time, and as your vision failed, your ability to do fine work would decline. If you were a teacher, you would face different challenges. Education in Rome was not a state function. It was private and was available only to those who could afford to pay. Teachers were typically poorly paid and had low social status, despite the importance of their work. As a teacher, you would gather students in a rented room or even in a corner of the public forum, and you would teach them reading, writing, arithmetic, and literature. The students would be boys, as girls were generally not educated beyond basic literacy. The teaching methods would emphasize memorization and discipline. Students would recite their lessons in unison, and those who made mistakes would be beaten with a rod. You would need to maintain strict discipline to control a room full of boys who would often rather be anywhere else than in school. The constant noise and stress, combined with the low pay and lack of respect, would make teaching an exhausting and frustrating profession. Chapter 6. Entertainment and Leisure. Let us consider how Romans spent their leisure time, as the lack of modern entertainment options would be another significant adjustment. The Romans did have various forms of entertainment, but they were quite different from what you are accustomed to, and access to them was limited for many people. The public baths were an important social center for kin to Romans of all classes. The baths were not just places to wash. They were elaborate complexes that included hot rooms, warm rooms, cold rooms, exercise areas, swimming pools, and spaces for socializing. Romans would spend several hours at the baths, bathing, exercising, conversing with friends, and conducting business. For modern people accustomed to private bathrooms, the public nature of Roman bathing would be uncomfortable. You would be naked or nearly naked in the presence of many other people. The baths would be crowded and noisy. The water would not be changed frequently, so you would be bathing in water that many others had already used. The heating system for the baths, the hypocaust, would make the hot rooms extremely hot, almost unbearably so. You would sweat profusely and might become dizzy from the heat. The transition from the hot room to the cold plunge pool would be shocking to your system. The exercise areas would be loud with the sounds of people exercising, and you might be hit by a ball or jostled by other exercisers. Gladiatorial games were a popular form of entertainment, but they were brutal and bloody spectacles that would be disturbing to most modern people. Gladiators were usually slaves or criminals who were forced to fight to the death in the arena for the entertainment of the crowd. The combat was real, not staged, and the weapons were sharp. You would watch men be wounded, maimed, and killed in front of you. The crowd would cheer for their favorite gladiators and would give thumbs up or thumbs down to determine whether a defeated gladiator should be spared or killed. The blood, the screams of the wounded, the sight of men dying in agony, all of this would be traumatic to watch, especially if you had any empathy or sensitivity. Yet Romans found these games exciting and entertaining, and failing to attend major games would mark you as odd or antisocial. You would be expected to participate in the collective experience of watching men kill each other, and you would be expected to enjoy it. Chariot racing was another popular entertainment. Races were held in the Circus Maximus, a vast stadium that could hold over 150,000 spectators. Teams of horses would pull chariots around a track at high speeds, with the charioteers risking their lives as they maneuvered for position. Crashes were common and often fatal. While chariot racing was less brutal than gladiatorial combat, it was still dangerous, and the death of horses and humans was accepted as part of the entertainment. Attending a chariot race would mean sitting or standing in the Circus Maximus for hours, crowded in with thousands of other people. The seats were stone benches with no backs, which would become very uncomfortable after a while. There would be no shade from the sun, no bathrooms, no concessions selling food and drinks. The crowd would be loud and excited, and tensions between fans of different racing factions could lead to fights. The entire experience would be far from the comfortable, climate-controlled modern stadium experience. Theatre was available, but Roman theatre was quite different from Greek theatre or modern theatre. Roman comedies often featured bawdy humor and slapstick physical comedy. Tragedies could be melodramatic and gruesome. The actors were usually slaves or freedmen and had low social status. The audience would be loud and rowdy, shouting, laughing, and commenting on the action. The experience would be more like a raucous sporting event than a refined cultural experience. For most Romans, entertainment consisted mainly of conversation and socializing. People would gather in the forum or in taverns to talk, exchange gossip, conduct business, and pass the time. Without television, radio, internet, books, or newspapers, conversation was the primary form of entertainment. However, the topics of conversation would be limited by the boundaries of personal experience and rumor. News traveled slowly, and most people's knowledge of the world extended only to their immediate surroundings and whatever travelers might report. Religious festivals provided breaks from work and opportunities for celebration. These festivals might include processions, sacrifices, public feasts, games, and theatrical performances. However, they were also occasions for reaffirming religious and social obligations, and participation was expected. You could not simply skip a festival to relax at home. You would be expected to participate in the communal activities. For women, leisure options were even more limited. Respectable women were not supposed to attend gladiatorial games or chariot races, alone or without male supervision. They could not participate in athletic activities or exercise in public gymnasia. Their leisure time would be spent at home, visiting female friends or relatives, or participating in religious activities. The restrictions on women's mobility and activities would be stifling for modern women, accustomed to freedom of movement and equal access to public spaces. Chapter 7. Conclusion and Final Reflections. As we conclude this examination of why you would not last a day in the Roman Empire, let us reflect on the cumulative weight of all these challenges. Each individual hardship we have discussed would be difficult to bear, but taken together, they would create an environment so harsh, so uncomfortable, and so alien to modern experience that survival would be extremely difficult for all but the most adaptable and resilient individuals. From the moment you woke in your uncomfortable bed in your small, dark, smelly room, you would face a series of challenges that would test you physically, mentally, and emotionally. The lack of basic hygiene facilities, the poor quality and limited quantity of food, the uncomfortable and impractical clothing, the harsh working conditions, the constant threat of disease and injury, the absence of effective medical care, the crowded and filthy living conditions, the noise and smells of the city, the lack of privacy, the rigid social hierarchies, and the ever-present possibility of violence. All of these would combine to make each day a struggle for survival. You would work harder than you have ever worked, performing physical labor from dawn to dusk, with minimal breaks and inadequate nutrition. Your body would ache constantly from dawn to strain, and you would have no effective means of relieving the pain. You would be hungry much of the time, as the food available would be insufficient in quantity and poor in quality. You would be dirty and uncomfortable, as the hygiene facilities would be primitive and the clothing would be rough and impractical. You would live in fear of disease, as illness was common and medical treatment was ineffective. A simple infection could kill you. A broken bone could leave you permanently disabled. Dental problems would cause chronic pain with no relief. You would watch people around you sicken and die, including children, and you would know that you could be next. The psychological burden of this constant threat would be immense. The social constraints would be equally burdensome. If you were a woman, you would have few rights and limited freedom of movement. If you were a slave, you would have no rights at all and would be subject to your master's whims. Even if you were a free man, you would be constrained by social hierarchies and expectations that would limit your choices and your autonomy. The lack of social mobility would mean that your station in life was largely determined by birth, with little opportunity for advancement through individual effort. The environment itself would be hostile. The city would be crowded, noisy, and filthy. The streets would be hazardous to navigate, with human and animal waste, rotting garbage, and the constant press of crowds. Your housing would be inadequate and dangerous, with constant risks of fire, collapse, and theft. The lack of modern infrastructure, including plumbing, electricity, and paved streets, would make even basic daily activities difficult and time-consuming. The absence of modern conveniences and technologies would be immediately apparent and would affect every aspect of life. There would be no refrigeration, so food would spoil quickly. There would be no running water, so every drop would need to be carried from a public fountain. There would be no electricity, so nights would be dark and cold. There would be no modern transportation, so travel would be slow, dangerous, and exhausting. There would be no telecommunications, so communication over distance would be impossible, except through physical messengers. The psychological impact of living in such conditions would be severe. The constant discomfort, the hard work, the poor food, the threat of disease, the lack of privacy, the absence of entertainment, and the general harshness of life would wear you down. You would suffer from chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. You would miss the comforts of modern life so intensely that it would be a constant ache. Every moment, you would be aware of everything you had lost, everything that had been taken away from you. If you were transported to the Roman Empire, you would almost certainly not last a single day before desperately wanting to return to the modern world. The physical hardships alone would be more than most modern people could bear. Add to that the psychological stress, the social constraints, the constant threats, and the absence of everything that makes modern life comfortable and secure, and it becomes clear that life in ancient Rome would be unbearable for someone accustomed to euphoric. Add to that the psychological stress, the social constraints, the constant threats, and the absence of everything that makes modern life comfortable and secure, and it becomes clear that life in ancient Rome would be unbearable for someone accustomed to 21st century living standards. This is not to say that the Romans were weak or that their civilization was not impressive. The Romans accomplished extraordinary things, building an empire that lasted for centuries, creating remarkable works of architecture and engineering, developing sophisticated legal and political systems, and producing great works of literature and art. But they did all of this while enduring hardships that we can barely imagine, and they did it because they had no choice. They had never known anything better, so they could not miss what they had never had. We, on the other hand, have known comfort, security, and abundance. We have experienced modern medicine, modern technology, and modern living standards. We know what it is like to sleep in a comfortable bed, to eat fresh, safe food whenever we are hungry, to be clean and comfortable, to be free from pain and disease, to have leisure, time and entertainment options, to communicate instantly across vast distances, and to have access to the accumulated knowledge of all human civilization at our fingertips. Having known all of this, we could never truly adapt to the harsh conditions of ancient Rome. So as you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, in your quiet, temperature-controlled room, with clean sheets and soft pillows, with clean water available at the turn of a tap and electricity at the flip of a switch, with modern medicine available if you need it, and abundant food in your kitchen, take a moment to appreciate how extraordinarily fortunate you are. You live in a time of unprecedented comfort, health, and security. You have opportunities and freedoms that the Romans could never have imagined. You have access to technologies that would have seemed like magic to them. Chapter 8: Marriage, Family Life, and Social Obligations. Let us delve more deeply into the structure of family life and social obligations in Roman society, as these would present yet another layer of challenges for a modern person attempting to survive even one day in this ancient world. The Roman family structure was fundamentally different from the modern nuclear family, and the expectations placed on family members would feel oppressive and alien. The Roman family was organized under the principle of paterfamilias, which meant that the oldest living male ancestor had absolute legal authority over all members of his household. This included not only his wife and children, but also his adult sons and their families, his unmarried daughters, his slaves, and sometimes even his freedmen who had once been his slaves. The paterfamilias had the legal right to sell family members into slavery, to arrange marriages without the consent of the parties involved, and even in early Roman history, to execute family members for serious transgressions. While by the late Republic and Bont Empire these powers had been somewhat limited by custom and law, the paterfamilia still wielded tremendous authority. If you were living under someone else's authority, you would have limited autonomy over your own life. Major decisions would be made for you, and you would be expected to obey without question. This lack of personal freedom would be stifling for modern individuals accustomed to making their own choices about career, relationships, and lifestyle. Marriage in Roman society was primarily an economic and political arrangement rather than a romantic partnership. Marriages were arranged by families to create alliances, consolidate property, or improve social standing. Love was not expected or required, though it might develop over time. If you were told that you were to marry someone you had never met, someone chosen by your father or other male guardian based on political or economic considerations, you would have no choice but to comply. For women, marriage typically occurred in the early to mid-teens, while men usually married in their late 20s or early 30s. This age gap meant that husbands were often significantly older than their wives, creating a power imbalance in the relationship. The young bride would leave her father's household to join her husband's household, where she would be expected to immediately assume the role of wife and mistress of the house, managing slaves and household affairs despite her youth and inexperience. The wedding ceremony itself would be an elaborate public ritual. The bride would be dressed in special clothing, including a flame-colored veil. There would be sacrifices to the gods, a feast, and a procession to the groom's house. Once there, the bride would be carried across the threshold, symbolizing her transfer from polthetibatimra of authority. The public nature of the ceremony and the symbolic transfer of authority would make it clear that marriage was not just a personal relationship, but a social and legal arrangement. Within marriage, the expectations would be clearly defined by gender. The husband's primary duties were to provide for the family financially and to represent the family in public and legal matters. The wife's primary duties were to provide for the family financially and to represent the family in public and legal matters. The wife's primary duties were to manage the household, supervise slaves, and bear legitimate children. Fidelity was expected of wives, and adultery by a wife was grounds for divorce and severe punishment. However, husbands were allowed much more latitude. A married man could have sexual relationships with slaves, prostitutes, or lower-class women without social censure, though relationships with married women of the same social class were still considered adultery. This double standard would be infuriating for modern people who value equality between genders. A woman who objected to her husband's extramarital affairs would have no recourse. she would be expected to accept the situation silently and maintain her dignity. If she was caught in an affair herself, she could be divorced, lose her dowry, and be socially ruined. The unfairness of these expectations would be difficult to bear. Divorce was possible in Roman society and became increasingly common in the late Republican Empire. Either party could initiate a divorce, though the social consequences were different for men and women. A man who divorced his wife simply sent her back to her father's house with a written notice of divorce. A woman who wanted a divorce would need to return to her father's house and have the divorce formalized through her male guardian. A divorced woman might find it difficult to remarry, especially if she was older or if there was any scandal associated with the divorce. Children were not automatically accepted into the family at birth. Newborn infants would be placed at the father's feet, and he would decide whether to raise the child or to expose it. Exposure meant leaving the unwanted infant outside to die from exposure, starvation, or predation, or to be picked up by someone who might raise it as a slave. While this practice became less common over time and was eventually outlawed under Christian influence, it was an accepted part of Roman life for centuries. Infants who were accepted into the family would be named in a ceremony held 8 or 9 days after birth. The high infant mortality rate meant that parents often waited to see if the child would survive before becoming too attached. Even after the naming ceremony, the risk of death remained high. Childhood diseases including diarrheal illnesses, respiratory infections, and various fevers killed many children before they reached adolescence. Parents learned to expect that some of their children would die, though this did not make the loss any less painful. Children who survived infancy entered a structured world with clear expectations based on gender and social class. Boys from wealthy families would begin their education around age 7, as mentioned earlier. They would study reading, writing, arithmetic, literature, rhetoric, and sometimes Greek. The goal was to prepare them for public life, for participation in politics and the law courts. Physical education was also important, as boys needed to be prepared for military service. Girls from wealthy families might receive some education, particularly in reading and writing, but their education was focused primarily on domestic skills. They would learn to manage a household, to spin and weave, to supervise slaves, and to conduct themselves properly in public. The ideal Roman matron was modest, industrious, and devoted to her family. Girls would be taught to embody these virtues from a young age. Children from poor families had a very different experience. They would receive little or no formal education, as their families could not afford the fees charged by teachers. Instead, they would be put to work as soon as they were able, helping with household tasks or working alongside their parents in the family trade. Childhood would be short, and adult responsibilities would begin early. The luxury of code and extended childhood devoted to play and education was available only to the wealthy. The relationship between parents and children was more formal and distant than in many modern families. Children were expected to show respect and obedience to their parents at all times. Displays of affection were less common than in modern parent-child relationships. Discipline was strict and physical punishment was routine. A child who misbehaved might be beaten, and this was considered not only acceptable but necessary for proper moral development. This formal distance in family relationships would be difficult for modern people who value close emotional bonds with their children. You would not be encouraged to play with your children or to show them physical affection openly. You would be expected to maintain authority and discipline, to prepare them for the harsh realities of Roman life, not to indulge them or treat childhood as a special protected time. Extended family relationships were also important in Roman society. The family included not just parents and children, but also grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. These extended family members often lived in close proximity, sometimes in the same household. Family gatherings were frequent, and family obligations were taken seriously. If a family member needed help, you would be expected to provide it, even at significant cost to yourself. The social obligations extended beyond the family to include a complex web of patron-client relationships. A patron was a wealthy and powerful individual who provided protection, financial assistance, and political support to his clients. In return, clients would provide political support, perform services, and show public deference to their patron. These relationships were hereditary and binding. If your family had been clients of a particular patron for generations, you would be expected to continue that relationship and to pass it on to your children. As a client, you would be expected to visit your patron's house each morning to pay your respects, a ritual called the salutation. You would wait in the atrium with other clients until the patron received you. You might be given a small gift, this food or money, called a boink sportula. You would then be expected to accompany the patron to the forum and to support him in his public activities. This daily obligation would take up a significant portion of your morning and would be unavoidable. Failing to perform these duties would be seen as a serious breach of social obligation and could result in the loss of the patron's support. The constant performance of social obligations, both to family and to patrons, would leave little time for personal pursuits. Your day would be structured around meeting the expectations of others, fulfilling duties, and maintaining relationships. The modern concept of personal time, of doing what you want simply because it pleases you, would be largely foreign to Roman society. Your value as a person would be measured by how well you fulfilled your social roles and obligations, not by your individual achievements or personal satisfaction. Religious obligations would also structure your time. The Romans were polytheistic, worshipping many gods and goddesses, and religious observances were a regular part of life. Each household would have a shrine to the household gods, the lares and penates, where daily offerings would be made. Failing to make these offerings could bring misfortune to the household, so they were taken seriously. Various religious festivals throughout the year would require participation, including sacrifices, processions, and feasts. The Doint Romans also believed in the importance of maintaining the favor of the Doint gods through correct performance of rituals. Any mistake in a ritual might invalidate it and require it to be performed again from the beginning. This created anxiety about performing rituals correctly and added to the burden of religious obligations. You would need to know the proper prayers, the proper offerings, and the proper procedures for various religious observances, and you would need to perform them exactly right. Chapter 9. Violence and Insecurity. Let us examine more closely the prevalence of violence in Roman society and the constant sense of insecurity that would result from living in a world without effective law enforcement or social safety nets. While Roman Saw was sophisticated and the Romans prided themselves on being a civilized people, the reality of daily life included much more violence and insecurity than most modern people experience. Street crime was common in Rome. Thieves, pickpockets, and muggers operated throughout the city, particularly at night. The Romans had no police force in the modern sense. The vigiles, who functioned as both fire brigade and night watch, had limited authority and limited numbers. They could not possibly patrol all the streets of a city of 1 million people. Most streets were dark at night, lit only by occasional torches or lamps, providing plenty of shadows for criminals to lurk in. If you needed to go out at night, you would be taking a significant risk. You might be robbed, beaten, or even killed. Walking alone was particularly dangerous, which is why wealthy Romans would be accompanied by slaves carrying torches when they went out at night. But even a group might be attacked by a determined gang of criminals. If you were attacked, there would be no police to call, no emergency services to help you. You would need to defend yourself or hope that someone would hear your cries and come to your aid. Even during the day, violence could erupt suddenly. Arguments could escalate into fights. Tavern brawls were common. Supporters of different chariot racing factions might clash in the streets. Political tensions could lead to riots. The crowded conditions and the absence of effective conflict resolution mechanisms meant that minor disputes could quickly turn violent. You would need to be constantly alert to potential threats and ready to flee or defend yourself. Domestic violence was common and was largely tolerated. Husbands had the legal right to discipline their wives, which could include physical punishment. The line between discipline and abuse was not clearly defined, and a woman who was beaten by her husband had little recourse. She could not call the police or seek protection from the authorities. She could appeal to her family, but if her family sided with the husband or did not want to get involved, she would have no options. She would simply have to endure the abuse. Violence against slaves was even more common and more severe. Slaves could be beaten, tortured, or killed by their masters with minimal legal consequences. While some masters treated their slaves relatively well, others were cruel and capricious. A slave who angered their master might be whipped, branded, or subjected to other forms of punishment. Slaves who tried to escape and were caught might be crucified as an example to others. The constant threat of violence was used to maintain control over the slave population. Crucifixion was one of the most horrific forms of execution used by the Romans. It was reserved primarily for slaves and for rebels against Roman authority. The condemned person would be nailed or tied to a wooden cross and left to hang until they died, which could take days. Death came slowly from a combination of blood loss, dehydration, exposure, and eventually asphyxiation as the person became too weak to push themselves up to breathe. The agony would be indescribable, and the public nature of the execution was intended to terrorize and deter others. If you witnessed a crucifixion or even just saw crucified bodies displayed along the roads as warnings, the sight would be deeply disturbing. The Romans used such displays deliberately to maintain order through fear. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who defy Roman authority. The casual use of such extreme violence and the public acceptance of it would be shocking to modern sensibilities. Gladiatorial games, as mentioned earlier, were another form of public violence that served both as entertainment and as a demonstration of Roman power. The games reminded everyone that Rome had the power to compel men to fight and die for the amusement of the crowd. The popularity of these games, the enthusiasm with which crowds cheered for violence and death, would reveal an aspect of Roman culture that modern people would find disturbing and alien. Military service was another source of violence that touched many Roman lives. Roman citizens were liable for military service, and soldiers were expected to be ready to kill and to risk being killed in service of the state. Training was harsh and discipline was severe. Soldiers who failed in their duties might be beaten or executed. In extreme cases, if an entire unit failed in battle, they might be subjected to decimation, a punishment where every 10th man was selected by lot and beaten to death by his fellow soldiers. Combat itself was brutal and traumatic. Battles were fought at close quarters with swords, spears, and shields. You would see men cut down beside you, hear their screams, feel their blood splatter on you. The psychological trauma of combat would be severe, but there was no recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder and no mental health support. Soldiers who were traumatized by their experiences would be expected to simply continue on, to suppress their feelings and maintain their military discipline. Even away from the battlefield, military life was hard. Soldiers spent years away from home, living in camps, marching long distances, building roads and fortifications, and enduring harsh conditions. Discipline was strict and punishment for infractions was severe. Pay was modest, and soldiers often had to wait years for any reward for their service. The promise of land grants or a pension upon retirement kept soldiers loyal, but many did not survive long enough to collect these rewards. The threat of war was constant. Rome was frequently engaged in military campaigns to expand or defend its territory. This meant that young men were regularly called away for military service, disrupting families and communities. The loss of a son or husband to war was a common tragedy. The economic burden of supporting an army and the social disruption caused by constant warfare affected everyone, even those who did not serve in the military themselves. The insecurity extended to economic life as well. There was no social safety net, no wont, unemployment insurance, no welfare system. If you lost your job or became unable to work due to injury or illness, you would have no income. You would need to rely on charity from family, friends, or patrons, or you would starve. The constant fear of destitution would weigh heavily on everyone, particularly those who lived at the margins of subsistence. Debt was another source of insecurity. If you borrowed money and could not repay it, you could be sold into slavery to satisfy the debt. While this practice had been reformed by the late Republic, debt bondage in various forms continued. The threat of enslavement for debt meant that borrowing money was extremely risky, but sometimes necessary to survive economic hardship. The stress of carrying debt, knowing that you could lose your freedom if you could not repay, would be immense. Natural disasters and food shortages were also threats. A drought, a flood, a plague of locusts, or a failure of the grain supply from Egypt could cause food prices to spike and could lead to famine. The grain dole provided free grain to many Roman citizens, but it was not always sufficient, and not everyone qualified for it. Hunger was a real possibility for many Romans, particularly the poor. The knowledge that you might not have enough food to feed your family would create constant anxiety. Chapter 10. Final observations on the impossibility of lasting a day. As we bring this exploration to a close, let us summarize the many ways in which you would struggle to survive even a single day in the Roman Empire. From the moment of waking until the moment of sleep, every aspect of life would be more difficult, more uncomfortable, and more dangerous than what you experience in the modern world. You would wake in discomfort after a poor night's sleep, your body aching from the inadequate bed. You would struggle with the primitive hygiene facilities, feeling dirty and uncomfortable, despite your efforts to clean yourself. You would dress in clothing that was heavy, impractical, and uncomfortable. You would eat food that was bland, coarse, and insufficient in quantity and quality. You would drink water that was potentially contaminated and wine that was rough and acidic. You would then face a day of hard physical labor, working longer hours than you have ever worked before, with inadequate breaks and minimal rest. Your body would ache from the constant strain. Your hands would develop blisters and calluses. Your back would throb from bending and lifting. You would be hot in summer and cold in winter, with no effective way to control your environment. You would be hungry much of the time, never quite satisfied by the meals available to you. You would live in constant fear of disease and injury, knowing that effective medical care was not available. A simple cut could become infected and kill you. A toothache could turn into an abscess that could spread to your brain. Childbirth could kill the mother, the baby, or both. The constant threat of illness and death would weigh heavily on your mind, creating stress and anxiety that would never fully abate. You would be constrained by rigid social hierarchies and expectations. Your freedom of action would be severely limited by your gender, your social class, and your legal status. You would be expected to fulfill numerous obligations to family, patrons, and the state, leaving little time for personal pursuits. The lack of autonomy and the constant need to meet others' expectations would be psychologically exhausting. You would live in a crowded, noisy, filthy city where crime was common and personal security was uncertain. The streets would be hazardous to navigate. Your housing would be inadequate and dangerous. Violence would be a constant possibility, whether from criminals, from authorities, from war, or from domestic abuse. The pervasive insecurity would make you feel vulnerable and threatened at all times. You would lack access to the technologies and conveniences that make modern life comfortable. There would be no electricity, no running water, no refrigeration, no modern transportation, no telecommunications, no computers, no internet, no modern medicine. Everything would need to be done by hand, using simple tools and methods. Tasks that take minutes today would take hours in the Roman world. The constant labor and the lack of convenience would be exhausting. You would also lack access to the entertainment and information that modern people take for granted. There would be no television, no movies, no radio, no bells, recorded music, no books except for a tiny educated elite, no newspapers, no internet. Your entertainment would be limited to conversation, occasional public spectacles, and religious festivals. Your knowledge of the world would be limited to personal experience and rumor. The intellectual and cultural poverty would be stifling. Most fundamentally, you would miss the basic sense of security and comfort that characterizes modern life in developed countries. You would not feel safe. You would not feel comfortable. You would not feel that your basic needs were being met. You would be constantly struggling, constantly worried, constantly uncomfortable. The stress would be overwhelming, and you would long desperately to return to the modern world where life is easier, safer, healthier, and more comfortable. If you were somehow transported to ancient Rome and told that you must survive there, not just for a day but for the rest of your life, you would be devastated. The knowledge that you would never again enjoy the comforts of modern life, that you would spend the rest of your days in discomfort, danger, and deprivation would be almost unbearable. Many people would not be able to psychologically cope with such a drastic change in circumstances. Depression, anxiety, and despair would be natural responses to finding yourself trapped in such a harsh environment. The Romans themselves, of course, did survive and even thrive in these conditions because they knew nothing else. They had been born into this world, and they had developed the physical and psychological adaptations necessary to cope with it. Their bodies were hardened by constant physical labor. Their immune systems had been trained by repeated exposure to local pathogens. Their expectations for comfort, safety, and convenience were calibrated to what was actually available in their world. They did not miss things they had never known. But you, coming from the modern world, would be like a fish out of water. Everything about you, from your soft hands to your weak immune system, to your high expectations for comfort and convenience, would mark you as unsuited for life in ancient Rome. You would struggle with every aspect of daily life. You would be slow, inefficient, and incompetent by Roman standards. You would make mistakes that Romans would never make because they had learned from childhood how to navigate their world. You would stand out as different, as foreign, as weak. And standing out in Rome was dangerous. Romans were suspicious of foreigners and of anyone who seemed strange or different. You would attract attention, and not the good kind. People might cheat you, knowing you were ignorant of local customs and prices. They might rob you, knowing you were vulnerable. Authorities might question you, suspecting you of being a spy or a troublemaker. Your strangeness would make you a target, and your lack of local knowledge and skills would leave you unable to defend yourself effectively. For all these reasons, lasting even a single day in ancient Rome would be extraordinarily difficult for a modern person. The accumulated hardships, the constant discomfort, the pervasive danger, the rigid social constraints, the primitive living conditions, and the absence of everything that makes modern life bearable would all combine to make survival a constant struggle. Most modern people, if transported to ancient Rome, would be begging to go home within hours. Those who were forced to remain would spend their days in misery, longing for the world they had lost. So tonight, as you prepare for sleep in your safe, comfortable, modern home, take the moment to feel grateful. Appreciate the clean water flowing from your taps, the electricity lighting your home and powering your devices, the comfortable bed waiting for tantalum poke, you, the food in your kitchen, the medical care available if you need it, the laws and institutions that protect your rights and property, and the countless technologies that make your life easier and more pleasant. All of these things would have seemed like impossible dreams to a Roman, magical beyond their wildest imaginings. We live in a world that, for all its problems, is vastly better than the world our ancestors inhabited. We have longer lifespans, better health, more comfort, more security, more freedom, and more opportunities than any previous generation in human history. We often fail to appreciate this because we have never known anything else, because we take our blessings for granted, because we focus on what we lack rather than on what we have. But if we could experience even one day in ancient Rome, we would return to the modern world with profound gratitude for the age in which we live. Sleep well tonight, dear listener, in your comfortable bed, safe and secure, well-fed and healthy, free and comfortable. You are extraordinarily fortunate to live in this time and place, and you would most certainly not last a day in the Roman Empire. Good night.